So just want to start by thanking you for the opportunity to speak to the forum today, and I particularly want to thank Peak Care for becoming, I suspect, the first peak body in the Western world. Wow, that's a big call, isn't it? To shine a light specifically on this huge, hidden and vulnerable group of children and carers in our community. Now, I'm pretty bad at this Zoom thing, especially not being able to see who I'm talking to, but I'm getting better at it. So I hope you'll bear with me with my ums and ahs. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation. They are the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and particularly in light of the consciousness that we all have, how historical processes have delivered directly to the situation where we have an appalling overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care today. Hopefully the work we're doing will go some way towards making things better. Okay, just starting by, I want to look at this from a kid's perspective. And you'll see my slides, I always make them pretty because I like to just remember that this is about children and families. Focus on that, not so much. So Sam was a young man who I met years ago through a focus group, and his comment was, I never thought of this as a form of care. I just thought I was going to stay with Nana or Granddad for this long time, that's it. Didn't seem weird or strange, went to the same school, same sense of stability and constancy. These words we use a lot. It was just a different location, different person you lived with. And I think this really goes to the heart of the best aspects of kinship care. Just, we don't really need to dwell on the definition. I think we all know it, but family-based care in the extended family or with close friends of the family, formal or informal. Okay, now I've forgotten to turn the timer on, so I'll let you read that slide while I turn it on now. So I think these are fairly well understood now. These are the findings of a range of studies over 20, 30 years, and they were collected and reviewed by Paul Nixon back in 2008, an English researcher. So that we know that overall, by and large, kinship care placements are more stable. Contact with parents is more frequent, but also importantly, contact with siblings not living together, and also contact with the rest of the family. I mean, how many of us would remember the importance of our contact with our grandparents? Now you might say, well, they're living with their grandparents, but there's other grandparents involved in a child's life. They may actually not be living with the grandparents. They might be with an auntie, for example. So contact across the network, and contact with cousins, something that's not talked about much, but most of us would remember from childhood, the pleasure we got from playing with cousins. We believe it's at least as safe as foster care. Many studies have failed to demonstrate that there's any greater risk in foster care. It may well be safer. That the children are doing just as well, if not better. That, like Sam, children generally like this sort of arrangement because they see it as more natural, more normal. And it's an arrangement which provides a greater chance of support into adulthood, and we know that children out of home care really suffer at that point when they leave. They turn 18 and get abandoned by a system. And I would love to see more research around educational progress, because with greater stability goes that chance of more educational remediation. And I believe we haven't done a lot yet in that field to say, how are kids doing educationally, and how are they doing not just at school, but in the post-secondary years in terms of getting an education for life and for employment. Some of the benefits, of course, come at the expense of the carers, and we've heard quite a bit about that today, so I won't sort of spend a lot of time on that, but we have to remember that it's good for the kids, but sometimes it wears the carers out an awful lot. And as we've heard this morning, the issues, they're very much the same for Indigenous families, except it's all more so. They tend to take on more children, they tend to be poorer. And that imperative to take on the children, your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews, whoever they are, that imperative's even stronger if you're an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. It's a comment from a carer that came back through an interview, through a survey I did a number of years ago. And a really sad one, again, from the same survey. I'm very hurt by this arrangement. I put in 100% and get nothing back. And sadly, that would still be the case for so many. All right, now I want to turn specifically to informal kinship care, because all those comments I have made really cross the spectrum of informal and formal kinship care. So we've heard some figures this morning about possibly in Queensland about 4 times as many children in informal kinship care as in formal kinship care. That I think goes across Australia from the work I've done, and Rachel's certainly right that trying to get figures out of the census is a nightmare. I've done some of it, and through our estimates, we were able to estimate that at least around 80%, 82% of households providing kinship care are doing that informally. In the UK and USA, the estimates that from census work is higher, and I believe that when we really know for sure, we may find that it's higher here too. So really, we're talking about a massive hidden group of families. So the work I did was on the 2011 census data. At that stage, I think the best estimates would be that we're talking about over 100,000 children nationwide, around 56,000 two-generational households. We weren't able to really get figures out of multi-generational households because there's no way of knowing who's looking after who. And this goes back to the problem that Rachel spoke about, that we can't really pick these things out of the census because there's no suitable question. 2021 census that we've not long had obviously will reveal higher numbers if somebody else gets a grant and goes looking for it. I'm not really sure it's worth doing that until we get a better question, and I'll come back to that later on. So in terms of research in this area, well, most of it focuses on formal or statutory kinship care, and one of the reasons for that is because it's much easier to access that group. We know who they are. There are authorities that will at times cooperate with us researchers to pull data out, but also because those authorities are also perhaps a bit more interested in the results than they would be about informal kinship care, which no authorities at this stage are very interested in at all. There is not very much research about informal kinship care of any sort, whether it's about pulling numbers out of databases or whether it's about the qualitative experience. But we do know there are 2 ways in. One is the purely family-led arrangements. The other one is via child protection, where the care arrangement gets made, but it's what I've called peripheral to the judicial system, in that a child protection worker may have been involved on multiple occasions, but it doesn't have to go to court because people aren't fighting it. Perhaps the mother or father isn't fighting the placement. And so those care arrangements get made by child protection, but they don't become statutory arrangements. And those children therefore receive no further attention or support. Now, this goes to the heart of the issues that previous speakers have raised about financial and other support being contingent on statutory arrangements. We have no requirement for registering these sort of arrangements, so nobody really knows about them. Whereas in the UK, if you're not an immediate close relative, so if you're looking after your cousin or your grandchild's sister, and believe me, that happens, it may not be your own blood relative, you would have to register that. Okay, now just looking again at the census data, Rachel, as I said, is right. It's a nightmare to try and extract this sort of data. I started off trying to find out not just how many grandparents there were, some work's been done on that, but I wanted to know about how many sibling kinship carers there were in Australia, because some work had been done in the UK and I wanted to follow up. They found surprisingly large numbers. I wanted to see if it's the same in Australia. The University of New South Wales did a big study about grandparent carers, and they looked at census data. And interestingly, they were able to come up with a range between 8,000 and 64,000 grandparent carers in Australia. Fairly a major range, you might say. And this is because we're dealing indirectly with the issue, because there isn't a question. I was able to pull out data on the basis of age, but again, I could only do that for 2 generational households. And so there are the figures that we produced, where we found that half of them were in those mid-years. So there'll be a lot of grandparents in there at the upper end of the spectrum, or even some very young grandparents in their 30s. But there's also going to be a lot of aunts and uncles and other relatives, family, friends, and so on in that group. 1/4 of them are the 60 pluses. Most of them are clearly going to be grandparents. But again, there's really quite a number of them headed by someone 30 years or under. So these are really not going to be grandparents, and we understand them to be mostly older sisters and brothers, overwhelmingly sisters, and young aunts and uncles. If we compare that with the database and what we know about children in statutory care, this data is supposed to be collected for children in statutory care, and it's reported by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Unfortunately, a lot of the data is missing because the field isn't mandatory in all states. Just when the child protection worker is filling it in, you know, there is a field for what relationship is the child to the carer, but you don't necessarily have to fill it in. And if they're in a hurry and they're overwhelmed, I guess they're not going to worry about that one. Our best guess is that about half are grandparents. But with the other group, the aunts, uncles, siblings, other relatives, and family friends who I rather suspect creep in to statutory kinship care at a great rate, some of them not really knowing the children very well. We just don't know what the percentages are there. I think the states are trying to do better on this, but it's going to be some years before we have reliable data there. And of course, we won't know for sure whether it's going to be reflected the same across the board with informal kinship care. So as a result of not having the data we would like, we have myths. So the first one, and people have referred to this, Rachel in particular has referred to this, that obviously at federal level, it was quite easy for federal parliamentarians to bat things back to the states in the belief that this is all about child protection responsibilities. That most kinship carers are grandparents, and as we've seen today already, the focus is very much on grandparents. As a grandparent, I wouldn't oppose that, but I would like to speak up for the other groups that are overlooked when we focus on grandparents. I've done some research around young kinship carers. I've done some research about the so-called family friends, and I can tell you they're a very mixed group. Some of them, I called my report fairy godparents and fake kin, because there were some real saints in that group, but there are also some arrangements that really looked fairly sketchy in terms of being kinship care. And kinship care are just like normal families. Well, some of the children would like to believe that they're just in normal families, but of course they come with issues that are complex and challenging for their carers. They come with family contact arrangements that are challenging, and they quite often do need additional support. So I guess this has really been my concern over some years now, that when I've spoken at a lot of kinship care forums and spoken at conferences, is that this field is very fragmented. As we've said, the informal group of kinship carers is largely hidden. There are small groups around the country who are advocating in this space, usually a mix of formal and informal kinship carers. In those groups, grandparents predominate, and bearing in mind they're probably the largest group, but not necessarily the majority. The others become add-ons, or they're frankly invisible. And in the community, you'll find that a lot of people easily understand the notion of grandparent care. They know somebody raising their grandchildren, but the term kinship care has to be explained to people because it's not familiar terminology. But we do know from the research that has been done around informal kinship care, and the research that's been done across the board with kinship care, that the greatest issue is poverty. It's an issue for statutory carers too, but for obvious reasons, it's a greater issue for informal kinship carers because informal kinship care doesn't attract a care allowance. All right, so now I'm going to go over, I'll be touching a bit on material that Rachel has introduced this morning, but possibly just taking a slightly different spin on it. What does the Commonwealth do for grandparent carers? Well, Rachel talked about the family tax benefit, but the struggles that some grandparent carers have to actually get access to it, because I guess partly because they have to demonstrate that they really do have their grandchildren in their care for significant time. The childcare subsidy that's available to some grandparents, but not to other kinship carers. And they give the definition of a grandparent, which is reasonably broad, but it is very grandparent focused. An aunt, for example, is not defined as a grandparent. We get to the lovely double orphans allowance. And this is about the only allowance that is available at present for children who are unable to live with their parents. This was introduced under the Whitlam government way back in time. And I guess the definition has been widened slightly over the years. So double orphan, the poor old double orphan doesn't have to have both parents dead now, but one has to have died and the other one has to be patently unavailable in a very long-term way. So as you'll see, imprisoned for at least 10 years in a psych hospital or a nursing home on a very long-term basis, or absolutely uncontactable. And, you know, that doesn't mean, oh yeah, we haven't seen him for a long time. And if you qualify for, if you meet all those requirements, you get the fabulous sum of $33 a week. We had a national framework for protecting Australia's children up until last year in place. And there is a thing that's been called the successor plan at the moment, and that's been prepared and some debate, but it hasn't actually quite gone into implementation yet. I'd hope that it actually will have a better name when it does, and successor plan. I've had a bit of a look through the successor plan. In fact, I was involved with consultations for it, where I pleaded for the word kinship to appear in it, as it did in the national framework, but that was not successful. You won't find the word kinship care in the successor plan, and that does mean it's pretty difficult then to get this plan to focus on kinship care. And again, Rachel's talked about the review of the census topics. Natalie has spoken about this too. There was a public consultation in 2018 and a number of us submitted in relation to this. I know the National Children's Commission has submitted, I think Wansley did, ACWA in New South Wales did. And we were pleased when the 8 new topics were selected, that they were recognised that these are things we need to find out about, and more contemporary measures of household and family relationships was selected as one of the 8. Unfortunately, this process is budget driven. It is very difficult to get new questions into the census, and it didn't make the final cut. We need to persist with this. All right, so let's have a look again now, and again, a little bit of this will overlap with what Rachel's said. And Rachel did focus on this, recommendation 1, recommending a comprehensive review of support to grandparents raising grandchildren and to establish a subcommittee. And she spoke about that the Parliament decided that wasn't terribly important. Looking at reviewing, again in recommendation 1, it was recommending that they review the data that comes in from the Grandparent Advisor line. This Department of Social Services Children's and Families Secretaries Group, that mouthful, was a state federal committee, a bit like COAG, and as it says, is a primary platform for jurisdictions to collaborate on innovative approaches to child and family issues. Make this a priority topic. I don't think that happened. Recommendation 4, Rachel touched on again about legal services and also funding for relationship supports and services, and recognising the complex intra-family relationships behind kinship care, and the access to professional counselling services. So really, and there was in fact again that a recommendation around census data, and a focus on Indigenous families. So yes, a bit of a sad picture because so little of that those recommendations were taken up. Now, Rachel perhaps didn't have time to mention that she also chaired another inquiry the following year into out-of-home care. This, of course, focused on statutory care, but there was a recommendation there fairly far back, as you can see, recommendation 34, that has relevance for us today. And that was recommending that in the national framework, which I've referred to, the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, it had 4 action plans, and at the time that we were up to number 3, and recommending that there was a project to develop and implement nationally consistent financial and practical support for statutory and informal relative kinship carers. There it is. And the establishment of a national peak body for relative kinship carers. And Rachel's touched on that. She's couched it in terms of grandparent carers, but she also recognised that there's a lot of carers outside of that cohort that need recognition and support as well. Again, we never heard any more about this one. So this is a comment I come back to. It's a comment that came out of, again, from the survey I did back in 2010. And it's one that sticks in my mind because I've done quite a bit of research since then. And it's always with this woman in mind. I do hope this research might help. Okay, that's the gloomy picture, but I now want to turn it on its head and look at the opportunities we do have for advocacy. So this afternoon, I think we're going to hear about a new project run by the Institute of Family Studies in collaboration with Murawin. And I don't know anything about this study really, so I'm looking forward to hearing about it. But I did find the press release from last year, new research to strengthen support for carers. And I love that line that this groundbreaking research will enhance support for carers across the nation and lead to better outcomes for some of our most vulnerable children. Here's our opportunity. We need to take the reins following this research report coming out and really hammering the government to make sure that this study is the beginning of better outcomes for these most vulnerable children. That Senate inquiry reference to legal services is obviously another one we need to pick up again with some vigour, and the relationship supports and services. And here we're looking at well outside of child protection. These are federal issues that are being addressed here. The census, Indigenous carers. And again, I think, it's been touched on several times this morning about a national peak body, about increasing allowances and nationally consistent financial and practical support. We're going to hear this afternoon about the unsupported child's benefit of New Zealand. And I'm really looking forward to this presentation because I've had a little bit of contact with the two presenters prior to this forum. And they're going to talk about how they actually got there. There, in fact, was an unsupported child's benefit prior to 2009. It looked a bit like our orphans benefit. It was pretty orphan-like, and they were able to get that benefit raised to the same level as the National New Zealand Foster Care Allowance. There's still numbers of problems in carers getting access to it, but at least it's there. And as long as it's there, then I guess we can work on issues of access. I see the opportunity starting with our double orphans allowance. Got to get rid of that awful name for a start and then work on the parameters of who's eligible. And I'm thinking about this a little bit like how the widow's pension of years gone by gradually became extended more to people, women who weren't actually widowed, women who were single, and gradually it became the sole parents benefit. Okay. We're looking now at Nirvana. There's Nirvana, isn't it pretty? And this is what I think kinship care in Nirvana or Utopia or heaven, whatever you like to call it, would look like. So I think first and foremost, we do need this national kinship care organisation. Now, maybe for strategic reasons, we're going to have to call it a national grandparents organisation. But all the grandparent organisations I know have this little sort of plus on the end. It's grandparents plus or grandparents and others or grandparents and other relatives. I would prefer that we start with the whole umbrella, the kinship care. But we'll just have to see how we can go. It does need to cross informal and formal. It does need to embrace everybody. It does need to be all states and territories, and it does need to be in collaboration with the ATSI peak, which presumably would be SNAIC. And I was heartened to hear the Indigenous leaders this morning talking about their commitment to this and their interest in this. The National Unsupported Child's Benefit, this is really, I think, this is the end game. This is where we need to get to. But alongside it, we do need that federally funded community-based program of support services. So it's not enough to tell kinship carers, go and see a counsellor or there's a family support service over there. These need to be accessible financially, but they also need to be staffed by people who understand the specific complexities that surround children in kinship care and their carers. The complexities of the intrafamilial relationships, complexity of family contact arrangements, the complexities of the legal issues, and so on. And so who are we going to hit with our advocacy? Well, obviously it'll be federal parliamentarians. Rachel has indicated that the Friends of Grandparents group has been in abeyance, but are getting going again. Senator Dean Smith is certainly very passionate about grandparent carers. He doesn't like to think about other kinship carers, but maybe we can encourage him to just a little bit. We've got Children's Commissioners in every state and territory, and we've got the new National Children's Commissioner. These are people who will support us, and they've had some exposure to these issues before. Families Australia also has a new CEO, and I believe he's actually listening into some of the presentations today, and I think he's a potential ally for us, and obviously the Bureau of Statistics. So there will be another review of census topics. By my reckoning, it would be in 2023. We need to have strong submissions into that. So this time we win with an update of their question about family relationships. Okay, let's make it the thing. Here are the references, which you probably won't be able to read, but I can send them to anybody who wants them. And I think I'm within time, Thomas, and I'm ready for questions.